and cultures, man. This is where we lost it at. We went into the slavery. This is Baruch 4 and 6. It says this: ye were sold to the nations, not for your destruction, but because ye moved God to wrath. Ye were delivered unto the enemies. See what I'm saying? And that's what happened during the slave trade. It says this: the following figures do not include deaths of enslaved Africans as a result of their actual labor, slave revolts, or diseases they caught while living among New World populations. We was catching them nasty European diseases that the Europeans brought over, man. Alright, this is Jeremiah 17 and 4. It says this: and thou, even thyself, shalt discontinue from thy heritage that I gave thee, and I will cause thee to serve thine enemies in the land which thou knowest not. For ye have kindled a fire in my anger, which shall burn forever. Alright? So that's exactly what happened. We discontinued from our heritage. It said the destruction of cultures. And we was going to serve our enemies in the land which thou knowest not, man. And that anger was going to burn for it says forever. Now you look it up in the Hebrew, that can also mean a very long time. And we know about other prophecies and scriptures that it ain't going to burn for a long time. The Lord's wrath is going to come up off of us. Alright? Let's read on. It says this: a database compiled in the late 1990s put the figure for the transatlantic slave trade at more than 11 million people. For a long time, an accepted figure was 15 million, although this has in recent years been revised down. Most historians now agree that at least 12 million slaves left the continent between the 15th and 19th century, but 10 to 20% died aboard ships. This figure, thus a figure of 11 million enslaved people transported to the Americas, is the nearest demonstrable figure historians can produce. Besides the slaves who died in the Middle Passage itself, even more slaves probably died in the slave raids in Africa. The death toll from 4 centuries of the Atlantic slave trade is estimated at 10 million, according to William Rubenstein. Of these 10 million estimated dead blacks, possibly 6 million were killed by other blacks in African tribal wars and raiding parties aimed at securing slaves for transport to America. Now, we know that when the Greek philosophers came around, if you had dark skin, you was considered an Ethiopian. And Ethiopian is a land in Africa. So after them Greek philosophers or whoever came on the scene, they, in history, when they rewrote the histories, they called everybody Ethiopian. Same thing going on here. They called everybody that had dark skin that was up in that land was African. All right, but you had black Jews, black Hebrews up in there, all right, fighting against Africans, okay? Now, it says this: the first Europeans to enslave Africans in the New World were the Spaniards, who saw auxiliaries for their conquest expeditions and laborers on islands such as Cuba and Hispaniola. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Hispaniola in 1501, after Portugal had succeeded in establishing sugar plantations in northern Brazil in 1445 or 1545. Portuguese merchants on the West African coast began to supply enslaved Africans to the sugar planters there. While at first these planters relied almost exclusively on the native Tupani for slave labor, a titanic shift toward Africans took place after 1570 following a series of epidemics which decimated the already destabilized Tupani communities. And those Tupani were from the 10 tribes of Israel. It says this: by 1630, the Africans had replaced the Tupani as the largest contingent of labor on Brazilian sugar plantations, heralding equally the final collapse of the European medieval household tradition of slavery. The rise of Brazil as the largest single destination for enslaved Africans and sugar as the reason that roughly 84% of these Africans were shipped to the New World. So 84% of the slaves that came over here was to work on them sugar plantations in Brazil. All right, or at least that's where most of the ships was going. I don't know if all of the slaves that got shipped there stayed there. It says this: merchants from various European nations were later involved in the Atlantic slave trade. Portugal, Spain, France, England, Scotland, Brandenburg, Prussia, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Almost sound like the 10 horns of the beast. Scripture says this: as Britain rose in naval power and settled continental North America and some islands of the West Indies, they became the leading slave traders. At one stage, the trade was the monopoly of the Royal Africa Company, operating out of London. But following the loss of the company's monopoly in 1689, Bristol and Liverpool merchants became increasingly involved in the trade. By the late 17th century, 1 out of every 4 ships that left Liverpool Harbor was a slave trading ship. Other British cities also profited from the slave trade. Birmingham, the largest gun-producing town in Britain at the time, supplied guns to be traded for slaves. 75% of all sugar produced in the plantations came to London to supply the high lucrative coffee houses there. Reading on, it says this: the first slaves to arrive as part of a labor force appeared in 1502 on the island of Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Cuba received its first 4 slaves in 1513. Slave exports to Honduras and Guatemala started in 1526. The first enslaved Africans to reach what would become the U.S. arrived in January of 1526 as part of a Spanish attempt at colonizing South Carolina near Jamestown. By November, the 300 Spanish colonists were reduced to a mere 100, accompanied by 70 of their original 100 slaves. The enslaved people revolted and joined a nearby native population while the Spanish abandoned the colony altogether. See that? So those Negroes knew that they could run to the native tribes if they got free from this white man. See what I'm saying? People say that Native Americans had Negroes in slavery. Well, I can show you in the scriptures where the 10 tribes put Judah into slavery. See what I'm saying? That's in the scriptures also. All right, but these Negroes right here, they went to the native people of the land and got with them. All right, and they took them in. All right, the scripture says this: Colombia received its first enslaved people in 1533. El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Florida began their stint in the slave trade in 1541, 1563, and 1581 respectively. The 17th century saw an increase in shipments with enslaved people arriving in the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Although the first kidnapped Africans were classed as indentured servants and freed after 7 years, chattel slavery entered Virginia law in 1656. Irish immigrants brought slaves to Montserrat in 1651, and in 1655 slaves arrived in Belize. Now, just to prove a quick point here in Deuteronomy 15, I'm going to show you where they got that indentured servant 7-year thing from. They got it from us, because Jacob is the former of all things. This is Deuteronomy 15:3. It says this: of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again. But, matter of fact, I started at the top. It says this: at the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release. And this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it in his neighbor or of his brother, because it is the Lord's release. Of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine, which is thy brother, but that which is in thine with thy brother thine hand shall he release. Alright. Now indentured servants, they became servants because they was poor or they had like a money to pay. They owed you something. Alright. But it's telling you there that we released after 7 years, and these Europeans told us we was gonna be released after 7 years, but we weren't. I got a couple more minutes on here. We're gonna read the distribution of slaves from 1519 to 1867. The destinations. Portuguese America got 38.5. British America, all right, not North America, meaning British, the land that was controlled by the British, excluding the North American continent, received 18.4% of the slaves. The Spanish Empire shipped 17.5% of the slaves. French America's 13.6, British North America 6.45, English America's 3.25, Dutch West Indies 2%, and Danish West Indies 0.3%. The number of the Africans arrived in each area can be easily calculated, taking into consideration that the total number of slaves was close to 10 million.